Hello, my name is Tammy Dewhurst, and I represent the Windsor Essex branch of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. We are so pleased to once again be taking part in Windsor's Jane Walk. For a listing of all the great walks scheduled this year, visit WindsorJanesWalk.ca. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Jamie Greer. Jamie is a journalist and musician. He is the face behind the Windsor Wrestling History Twitter page, and he is in the process of researching and writing a book about the Windsor wrestling scene titled Killers, Butchers, Crybabies, and Canadian Destroyers, History of Wrestling in Windsor. Welcome, Jamie.
Hello there. Thanks for having me.
When and how did you become interested in wrestling in Windsor?
Well, I've been a wrestling fan since I was probably about between 8, 9, and 10 years old, around there, and I'll be 50 this year, so that was a long time ago. But I grew up in the Niagara Falls area, and I moved to Windsor in about 93 for university, and ended up staying. And I just, over the years, I've always been drawn to the history of this that goes on in this area in all aspects. And when I was a musician, and I started playing around, and then I started getting really interested in the history of Windsor's music scene. So I was documenting that, and I was a music journalist for almost 20 years in the city for various publications. About 2016, I switched from covering music to writing about wrestling, my lifelong love and passion. Pro wrestling, that is, not this fake stuff you see in the Olympics. But and over the last few years, I kind of discovered little bits and pieces about our history. I mean, obviously we've got Border City Wrestling here, which is still going strong. But little things like Windsor having a couple members in the WWE Hall of Fame, and this and that and this and that. And then during the pandemic, I suppose I kind of just started following little wormholes here, rabbit holes here that were exposing me to a few more things. Discovering a few more names that I didn't realize they were from Windsor, and then this person's from Windsor, and then so I really kind of started going down into these rabbit holes, and started to uncover some pretty cool stories in regards to our history, and that it went back as far as it did, and then seeing as how Windsor's history with pro wrestling kind of grew up with most of North America's wrestling history. So we've been there almost since day one. And the more I discovered how some of the unique twists and turns of our story, the more I was like, well, you know what? I think I've got enough meat here to work on something. And so the past 6 months, I've just been doing a lot of research and reading, and I'm just starting to do some interviews. And it's all led to this magic moment.
I've read that the sport of wrestling began in a French circus in 1848. How did it make its way to Canada, and specifically to the Windsor area?
It's true. Yeah, that's where obviously actual wrestling goes back to the dawn of time. I'm actually reading a book from 1937 by a guy named Marcus Griffin, one of the first sort of exposés into the history of pro wrestling. And he kind of jokes that Cain and Abel was the first real main event in wrestling. So it goes back quite a bit, but pro wrestling as we know it, that's where most historians have kind of traced the origins back of it kind of becoming more of an entertainment aspect than an athletic contest. They were still athletic. They were still these would have been a lot more legitimate than, say, WrestleMania in terms of the actual sporting contest of it. But it was a traveling circus carnival that was kind of going through Europe at the time. They had these wrestlers on, and that spread all across Europe. Soon Britain was doing it as well, and then of course by the late 1800s, in America it was very common as well. Also around this time, but that whole concept seems to have come from a certain. His name is Jean Exbroyat. I probably pronounced that horribly wrong, but it was his carnival. And so that this whole aspect of a more performative style of wrestling led to certain styles. That French gentleman, Jean, I can't pronounce his last name again, but he kind of created this style. It was called a flat flat hand, I believe. Yeah, flat hand wrestling, which was a lot more. It was above the waist. You couldn't use, and so it kind of became the Greco-Roman style that became very popular in Europe. A Welshman, about 30 years later, a Welshman created, the same guy who created the Queensborough fighting rules that boxing still uses to this day, created catch as catch can wrestling, where he kind of incorporated a bunch of different styles. There was a bunch of different British styles, Lancashire, Scottish backhold, Irish collar and elbow, stuff like that. He kind of worked them all together and made his own kind of wrestling rules. And a lot of that is kind of the basis for that kind of style that a lot of North Americans use. And that became the big popular style in Britain in the 1800s there. And there was a lot of British immigration, obviously, Brits coming over to North America, to the US and Canada. And during the Civil War, there was a big rise in that, because a lot of the times, they weren't in battles every day. Sometimes they'd be sitting in their camps for days or weeks before getting sent somewhere else. So they would have little wrestling competitions, and you'd have an Irishman that had immigrated 2 years earlier, but now he's here fighting. And so they'd all brought their own little styles and had these competitions, which of course led to the American carnivals having it. So then it kept going and finally got bigger and bigger until they went into halls and arenas and that sort of stuff. And Windsor kind of was the earliest one I've traced proper exhibition when it was 1906. A gentleman named Nick Collins, he was an American wrestler who came through. But Windsor was in Detroit, had all of these kind of traveling wrestlers coming through, doing these exhibition bouts, big kind of bouts. And for Windsor specifically, 1929 was when we got into the pro wrestling business as we know it. We started actually about 6-7 months after Toronto did, primarily with the same promoter. His name was he was a Russian from Siberia. He was a former wrestler promoter named Ivan Mikkelov, who brought professional wrestling that was already going on in Chicago, New York City, Montreal, some of the bigger cities. I wanted to bring it to Toronto and organize it, because there had been stuff before. We wanted to organize it. And he kind of slowly branched out. He started in Toronto, built up there at the Arena Gardens there, and then he would move out. He was doing Hamilton and London, and then eventually Windsor got hit. And we had our first official pro wrestling card at the Armories downtown, which is still there. Now it's part of the University of Windsor. And that was on December 12th, 1929.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we're almost 100 years of official pro wrestling cards.
Wow.
Yeah.
Ivan Mikkelov is such a great wrestling name.
It is.
Yeah.
Ivan Mikkelov.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where no one's quite sure if that's his real name, or because a lot of the times the promoters would keep their wrestling names. And a lot of Mikkelov's accolades came from himself, and some of them seem to contradict some of the other ones he said about himself. So he's one of those, he was a carny. So his history is not as well known as some of the other guys that would come later on, but he was the first promoter here. He had a guy named Jack Milo, who was a Greek wrestler. Because Mikkelov was based out of Toronto, so Jack Milo ran his operations here in Windsor. He was the bookmaker, or the matchmaker, the booker, as they say, that he did all the cards and booked everyone in. Ed Strangler Lewis, who was a huge name at the time, he actually headlined our first main event. And the Windsor Arena was in May of, see if I got that right. Sorry, it was January 29th was the first. I wasn't even close. January 29th, 1930. So it was just over a month later that it all moved over to the Windsor Arena, because they were kind of doing it monthly at the Armories, or that was the plan. And it was just going to be too hectic because there was so much going on at the Armories at the time. So they managed to get a deal with, it was then the Border Cities Arena, and they started presenting on January 29th, 1930, only a few months after, or just over a month after. And ever since that date, Windsor Arena became a pretty a huge, it was our Madison Square Garden, so to speak.
Wow. And that
For
was not long after Border Cities Arena was built.
Yeah, yeah. At the time, we were the third most modern sports arena in North America, behind Madison Square Gardens, and I'm gonna totally lost the second one, but which is why we had the Red Wings here for that first year while the Olympia was being built.
Right.
Then the Olympia ended up trumping us, but we essentially had an NHL sized arena. Because it was originally built for the Windsor Bulldogs, which was our IHL team. We were it was a professional junior, not a junior team, but a farms team, it was a pro team. But we had to upgrade the Windsor Arena to 9,000 capacity in order to hold the Red Wings for their first year. So it was a big place still, and so we benefited from that. We got a lot of big cards. Unfortunately, the fact that it never got any bigger is why we stopped getting big cards 60 years later. But in the early days, the Windsor Arena was a big hotspot for sure.
Wow. So what sort of crowds did they see in the infancy and as it grew in popularity?
They did well. I would say the average probably, I mean, I haven't done this mathematically as of yet. I'm sure I'll get to that. But from all, I've managed to get probably about 60% of the attendance. The Windsor Star, thankfully, up until about the early 60s, still treated professional wrestling as on the same level as the NBA, or actually more so than the NBA. But you know, the NHL, Major League Baseball, NFL, that kind of stuff. So the day after every card here, there was a full write-up of who won, how they won, what the crowd was like, and for the most part, they would publish the attendance. They usually got it from the ticket box as they were leaving that night. They had some great cards that were up. Some of when they had a big draw, they were up there between 2,500 to 3,500. I would say on average, they were probably around 1,200 a show. But this is weekly though. So, I mean, I find that more impressive. They managed to maintain over 1,000 people. They obviously had there are some down periods where they were getting 500 or so in the arena, which I'm sure probably looked terribly empty. But they seemed to have a pretty good base. They had their ups and downs, but I would say about 1,200 was probably a safe bet for their average.
Wow. We talked a bit about the role that the proximity of Detroit has played to the sport, but could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we were tied very early on with Detroit. A lot of people, a lot of historians I've read so far in a lot of my research, I've written Windsor off as not really being that big of a deal to cover, because they've always assumed we were sort of an outer rim outpost, so to speak, for the Toronto territory. Most notably, the Tunney family, who ran Maple Leaf Wrestling pretty much from the 30s up until the mid 80s when they sold it to Vince McMahon Jr. But apart from the first couple of years there, where we were kind of a satellite for Ivan Mikkelov, once Mikkelov got out of the game, forced out in about 1933, Windsor kind of decided it was a bit more stable for them to ally with Detroit, because just purely from location reason, I mean, it was 4 hours to Toronto. I mean, it was probably a longer ride there back in the 30s. I'm sure it was probably 5 or 6. So it wasn't always convenient to have their head or the main person they got to report to that far away. So the next promoter that came in, an Australian guy named Jack Thomas, he definitely seemed to work more close with the Detroit offices, the Detroit promotions that were going on. By the third one was a guy named Bill Thornton. He took over in about 36, but he also worked more closely with the Detroit promotions. He had come through the Detroit promotions as a wrestler before that. And then in the 40s, it was a Blake Robertson, who was the first Windsor resident that became a promoter, but he super connected himself. He actually brought in Harry Light, who ran the NWA office for Detroit in Detroit as his matchmaker. So it really tied us to the Detroit main promotion. And one of the interesting things was during the next 20 years, roughly, while Harry Light was booking over here for Blake Robertson, Windsor became kind of like the AAA farm system for the Detroit territory. We had a lot of our own stuff going on as well, but we benefited because Bert Ruby and Lou Klein from Detroit were also the trainers for Detroit. But they would train all these young Michigan guys, prospects they had, or prospects from Southwestern Ontario. They would train them all here in Windsor, and then they would kind of work, kind of get their feet wet, so to speak, working Windsor and some in Detroit. Maybe not quite in Detroit yet, but they would work Lansing or some of the other little promotions or areas they had outside of Detroit. And then they'd work their way up to working the big stages in Detroit, and then they would kind of get shuffled out into the rest of the actual NWA territory system, which was moving on to Ohio or Wisconsin, and then across the Midwest to the West Coast and so forth. So it was very symbiotic. Apart from the first few years, for most of our, up until, Border City Wrestling still does shows with symbiotically through Impact Wrestling or what have you with promotions in Michigan. So it's still a very symbiotic relationship. I don't think you can tell either side's complete story without mentioning the other. Detroit's definitely a big part of the book as well, for sure.
Did Windsor have the equivalent of an Al Haft, the founder of the Midwest Wrestling Association?
Yeah, actually, Al Haft was the initial, the Midwest Association there. Before the NWA started in 1948, the Midwest Association was Al Haft's thing. He ran the Ohio territory. He worked with Detroit and Wisconsin. I don't think he was in Illinois. Oh yeah, he was. Sorry, he was in Illinois with Fred Kohler. Harry Light, the man I mentioned a few minutes ago, he was the Detroit promoter, and those guys, they were kind of jokingly called the Mini Trust because before the National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA started in 1948, which Haft and Light were both founding members of. The most of wrestling seemed to be run out of the big cities of like New York City, Montreal. Chicago wasn't even considered a big city at the time. They were Boston, and they were called the Trust, or the Big Trust. They kind of ran all the big stuff. So Al Haft and these guys started the Midwest Association to kind of make sure that they would take care of each other. Which was a big part of the NWA. So yeah, Windsor was very closely tied. Once Mikkelov left and Windsor decided not to remain part of Toronto's territory, they quickly kind of became South Detroit. For all purpose measures, they sort of latched on to Detroit because it was a lot closer. It's a lot closer to get across the bridge or the tunnel, which was still in its infancy there, to get over there and handle business. So it just made more business sense for Windsor to ally there. So yeah, Harry Light would have been our equivalent, that we would have been the power broker around that time.
Interesting. Who, in your opinion, is the most underrated wrestler to come out of the area, and who's your personal favorite?
Let's see. My favorite's probably always going to change. Right now, from the research I've done so far, right now it's a guy named Johnny Gates, Dynamite Johnny Gates. He was a real spark plug. He was a heel, the wrestling lingo jargon for a bad guy. He was a villain. He was a heel. He started off, he was born and raised here in Windsor. He was a scrappy kid. He was part of a street gang called the Raggedy Ass Rangers. Got himself in some trouble. I got into boxing and wrestling in high school, and worked with some youth clubs, became a pretty good amateur wrestler. In the mid to late 30s, they would on the pro wrestling cards, they would give local guys a chance, almost like an open mic, but they would let two of them they would open the show. They would get the first. So he did a few of those. And then by the early 40s, he finally decided to go pro, and he became a superstar here in Windsor, in his hometown. But it's funny that he was one of the few local guys who wasn't a good guy, or a baby face, or a face, as they say. He was a villain almost out the gate, and he was booed. There were riots. I'm reading reports of police officers literally pulling him away or keeping people off him. He some of the hardcore stuff that you see nowadays with the chairs and cutting people open and fighting out in the stands. He was an early purveyor of that. He was actually a tag team partner of the Sheik, the original Sheik from Detroit, who was a monstrous TV star. Before the Sheik broke into TV, he was in a tag team with Johnny Gates. But it's been fun because his whole career is pretty much all written out. So I managed to read through his entire exploits, and he was a big draw. There were times when there was rival shows where Gates would be in a main event and he would outdraw one of the bigger name guys that was across town. And he seemed to do pretty good Gates as well, or ironically, pretty good door numbers, like crowd numbers in Detroit as well. And he did around Ohio. Chicago's about as far as he went, though. He was a real homebody. He didn't like to leave Windsor, which is why he didn't progress. I've interviewed a couple of guys who were wrestlers back in those days, and they remembered him quite fondly. And they both said the same thing, that he would have been a big star if he had just stepped a bit outside of this our more local area. But he had no desire. He made good money. He wrestled. That was his full-time gig for a good 25 years, give or take. He just didn't. I've interviewed his daughter. Johnny Gates passed in 1990, but his daughter I spoke to recently, and she said that they wouldn't even go on vacations longer than 2 days. That he would get the itch to get back home. That
Wow.
he loved Windsor, Essex County, and he didn't want to stray too far. And he had his family and his friends, and had a pretty good gig, just wrestling 3, 4, 5 nights a week and hanging with the boys and everything else. He didn't need anything else, so he just lived it his way. And he was a real warrior. So he's kind of a guy that I've he's kind of my current fave from Windsor. But like it does shift around. Underrated. We've definitely got a lot that I think are probably a little underrated on some level. I think the one I think is the most underrated right now is probably a woman named Sandy Parker, who wasn't originally from Windsor. She's from Vancouver, BC, and she grew up watching pro wrestling on the West Coast there in Vancouver as a kid with her family and going to see shows. And she wanted to be a pro wrestler when she grew up. This is in the early 60s. So in 1968, she moved to Windsor. She had some family here, so she moved here and she lived here for about two years, or give or take. And she discovered Lou Klein, who again, one of the trainers over in Detroit. So she went and trained with him. So Windsor was her home base to get her training, and then she took to it pretty quickly. And she was working the territories faster than a lot of the guys. Like she was going down to Florida, which was further than a lot of them were going at that time. She was going all across the Midwest, Pacific Northwest, that kind of stuff. She was getting pushed quite heavily. She also got a big break when a few months into her training, Lou Klein realized she needed to sort of a more polished because she was doing so well. So she actually went to train under the fabulous Moolah, who a lot of people remember from the 80s there, from that wrestling. She was the evil villain. One of the reasons why her story is so not well known is she's mentioned in interviews that she's openly gay. She's a lesbian woman, and she's Black. She's an African Canadian. But the reason why was she wanted to hang out at gay bars when they were on the road, because Moolah's now booking her shows around the country, because the other girls all get to go to their clubs or what have you. And Moolah forbade her that she could do that. She wanted her to keep everything discreet, which that wasn't the biggest issue. It was because that she wanted her to be available for the male wrestlers. It was a pretty seedy business back then. So Sandy was quite strong in her opinions that she wasn't going to do any of that for her. So she actually left Moolah's team, and she went immediately to go and join the camp of Moolah's arch enemy, who was Mildred Burke, who was one of the greatest women's wrestlers of all time. She was from the 30s through the 50s. Huge draw. She would outdraw almost 99.9% of the men on the circuit. She was a huge draw. But her and Moolah had a falling out. And Moolah became she ran most of women's wrestling at the time. So Mildred Burke had essentially started wrestling in Japan for women, and what had become a very strong scene there. So through Mildred Burke, Sandy Parker went to go compete in Japan instead, because she was essentially blackballed from working in North America for a good chunk of time because of her leaving Moolah. But so Sandy Parker went over there to work in Japan for All Japan Women's Wrestling, which is still considered one of the top women's promotions, and she won their world championship. It was the actual belt that Mildred Burke had for 25 years when she was the women's champion, the big red belt. So she won the world championship, and historically speaking, it made her the first Black woman wrestler to hold a world championship in professional wrestling. This was in 1973. And as far as several researchers and I have come, she was the first openly gay wrestler to win a world championship of any kind. So, I mean, her roots are her path to everything started here. She eventually kind of made up with Moolah. They kind of came to an agreement of some sort, and she did come back and wrestled more frequently in the US and Canada in the late 70s. And she retired in the early 80s. She had once everything kind of went WWF way and went to more of that TV style, she she wasn't a big fan of it. She was more of a fan of the actual athletic presentation than the sports entertainment presentation. So she retired, and she lives in Las Vegas now. I spoke to her a few weeks ago. I'm supposed to be talking to her a bit later to fill in a lot more holes and talk a lot more with her. So I feel like her story is very underrated. So that would be my two choices on that right now.
She sounds like a fascinating woman, and she sounds like a book unto herself.
Absolutely.
Maybe the next one.
Yeah, maybe.
Who was the first female professional wrestler in Windsor, and how did the inclusion of women have an impact on the sport?
She was probably the first woman wrestler out of Windsor, actually, well. Now, the reason why is because the Ontario the Ontario Athletic Commission, we don't have a state, but our athletic commission on Ontario banned women from competing in any combat sports. For a long time, from long before we started wrestling in 1929. It wasn't until the end of the 60s that women were allowed to start competing in Ontario. So that was another big reason why she immediately hit. Once she broke in Detroit, she just immediately went, because she could wrestle anywhere she could go back to BC even, but she just couldn't compete in Ontario. She did eventually manage to wrestle in Windsor a couple times in 1970 and the year before that, and a few shows, but there was no opportunity for them to compete in Ontario. Ironically, it was actually the Windsor Walkerville MPP at the time, Bernard Newman, who put forward a change in the legislation to allow women to compete in wrestling and boxing. And he actually has a wrestling connection himself. His brother, Alex, was a professional wrestler from the 30s to the 50s, and was a big TV star from, out in the West Coast as a masked villain named the Great Bolo. So he knew about wrestling because he had a brother who was one, and felt that maybe he had nieces or grandkids that he wanted to see wrestle. So whatever reason, he got the ball rolling on allowing women to compete in these. And this wasn't just for pro wrestling. This was, they couldn't do boxing, they couldn't do jujitsu, any of these kind of things. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, like any combative sport, they were not allowed to. It was very unladylike, and it was a ridiculous thing back in when it was probably first done in the 1910s or what have you. But it was also equally more ridiculous to still be doing that in the 1960s.
Being ladylike is overrated.
Yes, we have had quite a few wrestlers since have come through or come out of Windsor. So I mean, we're catching up, but unfortunately, we had a good 65-year back. I was going to say head start, but we didn't. Everyone else had a 65-year head start on us, so
there you go.
We're getting there, though.
Yeah. So I know Bobo Brazil, who is credited with breaking down racial barriers in Detroit, fought in Windsor. Was there an equivalent of Bobo in Windsor?
Well, Bobo was in Windsor. He first appeared here in 1960 and was here for a good 15 years or so. After that, he came back for multiple things. He was a huge trailblazer. And I don't mean this with any disrespect to Bobo for what he did, because he was probably the biggest African-American star on TV. So that definitely helped open a lot more borders. But there were quite a few before him that definitely deserve some attention. Most people who follow the wrestling history know that, I mean, the South wasn't just wrestling, it was anything. It was heavily segregated. Wrestling was no different. Down in a lot of the southern states and other parts of the Midwest and sort of over in that area, they still had Negro championships. They were kept separate. African-American Black wrestlers weren't allowed to compete against non-Black wrestlers. Sometimes the entire show was segregated, that we held somewhere different, or if they were allowed in the card, it was treated as a novelty. In a lot of ways that women's wrestling was for a while as well. Same way they did with little people in the midget, unfortunately, the midget wrestling. You know, they were novelty shows. They weren't considered as serious as the whites competing. Bobo Brazil, when he came out in the 50s and really became a huge star in the Detroit area and nationally on TV, absolutely monumentally huge. He deserves every accolade that he's gotten as well. Windsor, luckily for we were not segregated right from the get-go. We were a lot of Southern African-American wrestlers would actually come up to some of the northern states to compete, just because they weren't as segregated or weren't segregated at all. Detroit was a very big area for that, and it was a good place to be for that, Detroit and Chicago, because of a lot of the industrial age happening. A lot of people were losing jobs in the crops and so forth, so they were coming up to these industrialized cities to find work. So Windsor was very lucky that we had non-segregated wrestling right from the get-go in 1929. In fact, we had a guy named Jack Nelson, who was from Cleveland, Ohio, I believe. Might have been Cincinnati, but I think it was Cleveland. He would go on to find more fame about 5-6 years later. He changed his name to King Kong Clayton, but he started off as Jack Nelson, and he competed here in Windsor probably by about the third or fourth card into early 1930. And he was competing against the white wrestlers right off the bat. In fact, he was in the first real program again to go against the champion we'd had here, who was another Greek wrestler. Jack Milo, the bookmaker, liked to bring in his fellow Greek wrestlers. So we had a gentleman named Jimmy Logas, who was world light heavyweight champion, as one of our main stars for the first couple of years. And the first real storyline or program that we had in Windsor was this Jack Nelson coming in, and he built up a good 6-7 win streak in a row and became the first sort of locally built star to challenge for the title. We didn't win, unfortunately, but very few did. I mean, Logas kept his title for, pretty much the whole 2-3 years there. So nobody got to beat him no matter what color they were. But it was, right off the bat, Jack Nelson got a huge push. So I think because slavery was ended in Canada, 30 years prior, we had a bit of a head start socially wise. So it wasn't as big a deal. It wasn't still as, don't get me wrong, I'm sure it was probably still horrendously racist by any terms. But it wasn't unusual to see black athletes competing against or alongside the white athletes. There's another gentleman named William Parker who went by, I'm sure wasn't an intensely nice, he went by Gorilla Parker at the time, but his name was William Parker. He was used early on as well. Again, non-segregated. He wasn't as much of a star as Jack Nelson. Jack Nelson, by all reports, was pretty charismatic and was a big local favorite here. William Parker was more of didn't compete as often. He was more of a heel that would come in once in a blue moon. He was a tougher guy. Let's see. Probably the biggest star we had, who would have been Bobo Brazil, was probably a guy, the original Black Panther. His name was Jim Mitchell. He wrestled as the Black Panther. He came out of Louisville, Kentucky, and started wrestling in the late 20s, early 30s. And he started off in a lot of these Negro matches and things of that nature, the Negro circuits. But he managed to prove himself pretty quickly as a top tier grappler. He was a solid technical wrestler, very charismatic, got over with the crowds, didn't matter their color, creed, heritage, whatever. He hit Windsor in about 1933, 34. He competed at the arena quite often. He was actually here until about 56, 58. So he had one of the longest tenures of any wrestler back in that first 30, 40 years. He had a good 26-year run here. And he never turned heel. He was the hero the entire time. He always got huge title shots. He was a big draw. So Jim Mitchell was probably our Bobo Brazil. He was a huge draw here, huge star, and that was 20 years before Bobo Brazil, and for 20 years before, up until Bobo Brazil made his Windsor appearance, and a good 20 years before Bobo Brazil made his own appearance in his native Detroit there. Well, he's actually from Benton Harbor, but yeah.
Oh. So thinking about Abdullah the Butcher's fork, how
Yes.
frequent were serious accidental injuries?
With Abdullah, who knows? Abdullah didn't wrestle much or in Windsor. I'm not even sure if he did. He may have had a couple, but he's got interestingly, he started in the mid 60s. And by the time he was discovered over here. But by the time he kind of got discovered and he was getting ready to be pushed, Windsor's territory was in a rapid decline. We had been pretty strong and healthy, but it was mainly because the Detroit scene was in chaos. It had changed ownership, of the territory, but 3 times, some of it hostile. There was hostile invading outlaw promotions, trying to come in and take the territory. It had just been taken over by the Sheik, who was hitting his peak, and he was a TV star as well. So he didn't really focus on Windsor as much. He used Windsor for TV tapings and so forth, but he didn't really book Windsor the same way it had been the previous 30 years. So by that time, Abdullah pretty much just worked the Michigan, Detroit area. But that being said, there was plenty of those kind of shenanigans for the 30 years prior. Johnny Gates, who I mentioned, he actually, reading some of the reports about him, he used a coat hanger on his opponents. It was a double-edged weapon that he could use, because he could take the triangle part that you put, the shoulder part that you put your coat hangs on. Well, he would pull that out into a diamond, and he would put it around his opponent's neck, and then he would tighten it again and choke them out. And if that didn't work, he could always just bend over the hook and scratch them. Oh yeah, and this was in the 1940s. So it's funny when a lot of people say, there's all these weapons and violence in wrestling today. It's been around for almost 100 years, and a lot of it originated in this area. I mean, we had the Sheik, Wild Bill Curry from Detroit, who was also over in Windsor a lot. Was an early purveyor of cutting himself to make it look like he was hit more and so forth. So Detroit was a rough town that created some rough wrestling, and Windsor being right beside it, we played right along. So and there's a lot of injuries that I read in these things. Most of them didn't seem to come from weapons, thankfully. Most of them seemed to come from awkward falls. It didn't seem like they were putting padding down outside of the arena. So when they were thrown out, sometimes guys were thrown over the top rope or through the rope, and they would land awkwardly, and they would break an arm or a wrist, and they'd be gone for a few months. But at the same time, it's tough to gauge if that was true or not, because sometimes they would use these stories to write a guy out so he could go off to Chicago and then down somewhere else for a few months. So the best way is to tell him he's injured, and he'll come back when he's not injured, and miraculously a broken wrist would heal itself in 3 weeks.
So in the people that you've interviewed and the children that you've spoken to, have you seen long-term effects on the wrestlers of the mid-century from the sport?
I haven't really got into that. They've all have no regrets. They all seem to look back on it fondly. I think the camaraderie is a big thing. Also, I mean, the people I'm speaking to are in their 70s and 80s now, so it wasn't really a subject I really broached with them. I mean, some of the younger guys, it might be something I might approach, but these guys were just ecstatic to talk wrestling, and some of them just hearing their. And I spoke to them on the phone, so I couldn't see them, but you can kind of hear their eyes light up. Their spirits kind of pick up when I mention the name that they haven't thought about in 30 or 50 years. So they definitely, I mean, a couple of them, they seem to take pride in some of the bruising they caused. So I couldn't answer that. I don't know honestly, but they definitely seem to have a very fond recollection that it was something they didn't regret doing for whatever time they did. Some of them were only 10 years. Some of them did it for 60 years. So they all seem to have pretty good memories.
Yeah. It seems like a number of big names in wrestling today have come out of local wrestling schools, like the CanAm Wrestling School. Was Windsor always at the forefront of professional wrestling education, and were there any key moves developed here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the big thing, CanAm Wrestling, that Scott Demore and his crew have built up. Windsor is now, I would say we're probably a bigger destination now than we probably were in the last 20 years than we were previously. Although I think that's more because I don't think it was as well known. But Windsor was definitely on the map, mainly because of our ties to Detroit. Because from about I would say probably the mid 40s to the 60s. Our training group was the same trainers that trained Detroit, and that was Bert Ruby, Lewis Klein. Eventually, other people got added. George MacArthur, better known as George Crybaby Cannon, was also trained people here. Gino Brito, who was a Montreal legend, he started his career here because his dad was one of the bookers and guys who ran stuff out of here. So we definitely George the Animal Steel was trained here, the
Oh, wow.
WWF guy. The guys won't tell me the name of the church. I don't know whether it's because they've forgotten it or they want to protect the guilty. But apparently, the training was done here. It was done in the basement of one of the churches here in downtown Windsor for a good chunk of that. By about 64, 65, the Detroit training had moved back over to Detroit, it seems. So, but we were definitely a place. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Sandy Parker moved to Windsor, was because she wanted to train in this area. So it was definitely, but I would say that we're probably more of a global destination now in the last 20 years because of Scott D'Amour's CanAm wrestling school. You can look at almost any major promotion on TV, whether it's the WWE, AEW, Impact Wrestling, formerly known as TNA. Even in New Japan, they've got people who have gone through the schools there. It produces world-class stars, and a lot of world champions have earned their stripes on the CanAm floors, that's for sure.
So that's a question for our members. Do they know which church?
Yeah. If anybody, I'm assuming it would be one of the ones downtown. My secret guess is it might be the St. Andrews one. That's my gut feeling, but that could be because I'm Scottish, and I might just be cheering for my own patron saint, but we'll see.
Yeah. So were managers like Crybaby Cannon the forebearer of the type of wrestling we see today?
You mean for managers?
Yeah.
He's probably got some fingerprints on it, but he definitely didn't start that style of that would have been Bobby Davis in the 1950s. He kind of really started that kind of swagger. He was before that, people didn't have managers, so to speak. They had what they called seconds, which was it was like in boxing. You can have somebody come out with you and be your ring guy that if you need to rest or that kind of stuff. So they were called seconds before Bobby Davis really blew things up. Windsor had a few people that were seconds. Usually it was how Windsor would get around that pesky no women allowed in the athletic contests. We had the female valets before, just out of forced necessity, because the women couldn't wrestle, and sometimes there was wrestlers who their real life wives wrestled, or they were part of a team or a group or something like that. So we had a few here before that, but Bobby Davis was the kind of set that blueprint of the suit wearing, fast talking sort of Colonel Parker. He was almost kind of like Colonel Parker, who people might not know, but he was the manager of Elvis Presley. That kind of smooth talking, sly, scummy businessman. But Bobby Davis was a younger, good looking guy, but he had slicked back hair. He looked kind of like a cross between James Dean and Elvis himself. So he was a pretty nasty, hated, villainous heel manager, but he kind of really started that blueprint that people like Bobby the Brain Heenan would pick up on, and George Cannon would kind of take elements from. But George Cannon was definitely was a big time manager in the late 60s, early 70s there with the Kangaroos in this area. Cannon would have a far bigger influence later on when because he lived here and he was running a wrestling TV show out of Windsor that became quite big. But his managerial stuff was definitely still stuff that's talked about today for sure.
Wow. So finally, I have a question from one of our members. Do you write for the Last Word on Sports?
That's true. I do. I write for the Last Word on Pro Wrestling, which is a division of Last Word on Sports. I started back there, and I started with them about 2016. That was actually when I quit covering music and I jumped into wrestling. I got hooked up there from a friend of mine, Aaron. And then he kind of stepped down from there, and I took over as the managing editor for about 4 years. I think it was from late 2016, early 2017 till about just beginning of the pandemic. And then I realized that it was just too much for me to work on and with duties and so forth. So there's now a great gentleman named Alex who works with a great staff, and he's taken over. I still do write for them periodically, although I'm currently on a sabbatical. While I work on this book, it was just too much to keep up with everything that's going on in today's wrestling world and on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, and do this. And I've written for Pro Wrestling Illustrated as well and a few others, but yeah, I do. Long story short, I guess I do.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jamie, and thank you to everybody who was watching. As you may know, the Windsor Arena is a building at risk. It's a wonderful and rich cultural history and is worth saving. If you, like us, don't want to lose this wonderful architectural gem, write to the mayor and your member of council and make your voice heard. Also be sure to check out the other great Janes Walk. Again, that URL is WindsorJanesWalk.ca, and follow Jamie at Windsor Wrestling History on Twitter. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Thank you, and save the barn.
Yep, save the barn.